Contention 1 is putting the frame back in framework. Our argument is that traditional conceptions of affirmation compulsively refuse to acknowledge that endorsement grants legitimacy. We should approach advocacy from this ethical perspective. The ESA point is that bad methods breed bad policy. Our argument is that we have to engage in an examination of the methodological formulation of policy in order to have a sufficient lens for the propagation of policies that are not ethically bankrupt. A good example of this is the lack of nexus strategy in Iraq, which manifested in problematic policy. We have to engage in methodological questioning as a precursor to engaging in effective policy-making decisions. The ESA point is that all debate is representational. At the end of the day, we all know that the plan doesn't actually pass, but the way in which we represent particular things endemic in the way in which we talk about things like dissad strategies or our affirmative are ultimately the only thing that we have. All debate is representational and all debate is only representational. The CSUB point is that thought precedes action. Our argument here will be that any action that happens derives from a particular thought project, which means that a thorough examination of the ontological foundation in which the thought that we occur happens is ultimately a precursor to the determination of whether or not we can have meaningful action, which means that these are prior questions to whether or not we should or should not act in a particular way. Contention 2 is the advocacy. Our argument is that the resolution presents an opportunity to recast the international system and the realist politics contained therein. For example, the strategy of offshore balancing is ultimately geared towards decreasing the prospect of aggression and promoting dialogue and self-determination. It ultimately rejects the notion that the United States perspectives should be forced upon the world, and this is consistent with the adoption of what we would refer to as a feminist lens, which attempts to root out the structural violences endemic to the patriarchal international system and try to find modes of breaking down those kinds of structural violence and the intertwining nature of different kinds of violence that are endemic to patriarchy. For this reason, we affirm the topic and its implicitly feminist lens and feminist politics contained therein. Again, for this reason, we affirm the topic and the implicitly feminist lens and feminist politics contained therein. Contention 3 are the impacts. The first argument is that we'll control the root cause of violence. Our argument is that there is no kind of violence that is not ultimately reducible or attributable to a masculine-feminine dichotomy. These kind of dichotomies are critical because they are what enable us to stack up particular groups of people against each other and engage in mobilizations of extermination. For example, the ability to classify the other as feminine and barbarous is ultimately the reason why we are able to manifest massive amounts of violence in the international system. This is the way in which violence manifests in a larger scale and can coalesce into larger strategies that can tie in wholesale extermination strategies. A good example of a strategy that would be a feminist strategy in order to counter those things is what happened in Cambodia, where our strategy was specifically premised on adopting a perspective that says that we should not be sending people with guns. Instead, we should try to promote the notion that we should try to promote the notion of ending structural violence through stopping things like poverty. There have been specific examples in which international institutions and bodies have adopted these kinds of perspectives, and there's lots of empirical instances in which that has been an effective strategy in rooting out violence. However, as long as we maintain the dichotomization that is endemic to the kinds of masculine, feminine categorizations and dichotomies that manifest in violence, we will never be able to break out of this kind of system. This is the reason why violence happens. The second argument is that we cause a reaffirming of the value to life. Our argument is not that there can be a 0 point to the value to life, but that life can be deprived of its value on a particular scale, which is to say that we have the ability to make sure that we can cement quality lives. Our argument is that in a world where our actions are ultimately motivated by problematic methodologies like informed by patriarchy, that's ultimately problematic. The kinds of masculine impulses that drive us to go to war with other countries and even to war with ourselves in terms of demobilizing structural violence and peripheralizing it and never considering it in terms of our conceptions of reality ultimately is problematic because it sends the signal that life ultimately is not something to be valued or treasured. That is a problematic perspective because that is the underpinning of all kinds of management strategies that manifest in problematic acts of violence. Our argument is that only through reaffirming the value to life through a strategy that acknowledges that people ultimately do have value and that we have the ability to attribute that value is ultimately important. This will be a precursor to competing impact claims insofar as the capacity to make sure that we can attribute value to life is the only way in which we can stop violence. For example, we could not have nuclear conflict in a world in which nobody had the motivation or the political will to determine that life didn't have the value in order to justify that conflict in the first place, which means we will control the impact calculus. Then the next argument is the invisibility of violence. Our argument is that in a world where our perspectives and worldviews are ultimately informed by patriarchy, which is endemically structurally violent, that is problematic insofar as it pushes violence on the periphery. We ultimately refuse to consider the concerns of the third world or peripheralized people within this framework, which makes violence something that's invisible, constantly pushed under the rug. The invisibility of violence is something that should ultimately come before other deliberative concerns insofar as when we make violence invisible, we literally preclude the prospect of being able to root out those kinds of violence, which means that the invisibility of violence is ultimately a very meaningful impact argument in this instance. Our argument is that when we constantly push suffering under the rug in favor of a larger call to order and calculation, that's ultimately something that always makes violence something that we push under the rug and ignore. That invisibility is ultimately critical to the ability to not consider ethical calculations, because when violence becomes invisible, we are literally not even completely aware of the way in which structural violence and patriarchy manifest to coalesce worldviews within us that condition us to be violent and condition us to accept violence. That is ultimately problematic. Our personal orientation to these things is important because the only way in which we can coalesce large-scale strategies for transforming society as a whole is to change within us. This is why almost all peace studies scholars talk about the fact that we have to have the ability to make the personal determination not to be violent and to embrace peaceful strategies before we can ever have any hope of changing society or having any kind of transcendental social transformation, which means that we have to examine our personal relationship to the institutional violences that happen that we constantly ignore. The next argument is that gestures representing unbelievable possibilities are ultimately a prerequisite to the mobilization in the name of social justice. There was a time in our history in which the Civil Rights Act was something that was considered impossible, something that would never be on the horizon, but the struggle to try to promote the kinds of politics of inclusion that ultimately manifested in that were ultimately really important. We have to interrogate our relationship to the topic because fiat-centric education as an exclusive model of education ultimately absolves us of our guilt for participation within violence because we assume that we are pretending to be somebody else. These kinds of utilitarian calculations are problematic because our argument is that when we premise things on a body count, that means that 4 million deaths is ultimately not a tragedy, but a few billion ultimately is. These kinds of deliberations ultimately assume that people don't matter. Even if violence is inevitable, it's how we respond to it that's critical. The search for creating desirable conditions for those in poor conditions justifies macro-social risk. 1% risk deliberation does not prepare us for real-world public deliberation. All that we get is more Dick Cheney, and rationalizations of catastrophe are the root cause of the kinds of paranoia and fear that ultimately justify the problematic politics we criticize. Contention 4 is theoretical perspectives. Resolving our affirmative comes before procedural concerns because you have to determine if it has value before you determine if you should exclude it. You should have to have a link for a theory argument. We'll defend the affirmation of our criticism in liberal academic space. There's no status telescopes monitoring what we say. We have to listen and take notes in debate, and we don't comparatively demonize each other for ideological reasons because everything is fair game and an objective flow game. And education outweighs fairness is a question of 45 minutes versus the rest of our lives. Fairness arguments are premised on an inclusion-exclusion binary that deems people unworthy of participation based on a different orientation to a fluid activity, and marginalized education matters the most because it's constantly peripheralized while other forms of education are obviously normalized.
Yeah, I knew. All right. You were so nice to us for giving us the AFF statement. Here it is.
They gave us one too. We have to.
Do you want one? I used to write one for panels, and then they just started looking really annoyed.
We gave them one?
Yeah, they have to share it though.
All right. There will be one off, long, oh yes. Shocking. And then we will go case order starting with their framework, then the implications, and then I don't really know when the differentiation came between that and solvency, but basically just in order.
For my sake, for the NEG, is this one off 4 sheets of paper,
Yes.
5 sheets of paper? I'm just asking so I know.
Well,
Probably 5.
I mean, I float on 5, you could probably do it on 4, depending on how you flow. I mean, you probably could do it on 2 if you're like.
But I like.
Yeah, if you want to separate it, then there's like 5 different sheets.
Okay, that's what I'm asking. Is it 4 or 5 parts?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Is everyone ready?
It's one off, then case.
Then case order.
Yeah.
Hell. Huge politics dissent. No.
Wheat.
It's E-spec, right?
So many standards now. Okay, all right. Ready? Our interpretation of PMC must be held responsible for the way the construction reinforces the underlying epistemology of Casey. Standards first, critical education key only through our interrogation of the world can be allowed for a critical reevaluation of deeper questions of ethics. We say that ethics are key because we are all philosophers and academics within our debate round. If you accept their arguments as true, then you would think this is uniquely true, especially because ethics are the foundational basis for all of their philosophical schools of thought. The number 2 argument is, I don't really need to say policy yet, making education non-unique, because you guys fucking hate that too. Next argument is core negative ground. The language of the resolution is the only thing that we have during prep, which means it's the only way that we can effectively construct our strategies. The next argument is negative flexibility. Ethics have to just speak first and last and define the parameters of the fact that they were able to read an equally unpredictable affirmative means that they additionally have a unique edge over Tom and I, which means that you should allow us to be able to read an epistemological argument. Additionally, we say it's most conclusive. They get access to their app just to prove that their app occurs and matters. Jeff Jones, this one's for you, Das Ubermensch. What is it that compels us to assume true and false or antithetical truth, untruth, good and evil are inherent conditions of life? We have 3 examples. The first of this is Stoicism. The Stoic precept of living according to nature did not draw knowledge from nature. Philosophers forced their morality and ideals onto nature and forced them to comply with those standards. The number 2 argument is Kant. Kant's pride in morality is categorical imperative, merely referred to old morals codes using dialectical battling. Even though he had all these really cool terms like agency that he was able to use, it was all a mask for the construction of agency, and also the fact that we cannot do violence upon one another. The last argument is babbling of intellectuals and merely obfuscates the permeation of their total mentalities. The links. First link is their refusal to question their values. The app takes for granted the values of its goals. The app presumes that their method and approach to the alleviating suffering is the only correct one. The fact that they can say that we have to break down patriarchy, that is the root cause of all violence, is a warrant for this argument. The number 2 is that they attempt to control their world. Their belief that the plan and their advocacy alone can secure the globe and prevent a variety of different violence scenarios is a refusal to accept life. Their use of impacts is an externalized bullying in the name of what is right. They can use false precepts of suffering to justify their action and their actors. In fact, they can say our might is right, and that anything that goes beyond this is hella screwed up and allows for all of the implications of our app is an example of this. The third argument gets you to the bottom. Their attempt to pin causality, they isolate onto particular social structures and enables them to avoid being answerable for any problem. So even if I make disadvantages based on this, they can assume that their method of idealism is the only correct one. They can effectively sidestep all of the major issues that will be associated with said idealism. Additionally, we said that we consistently ask how we can do more without asking why life is worth living in the first place. The fact that they're able to say that life is meaningless under patriarchy is another example of this. The last link is we say that their approach to the world is a passive observation. It begins from the premise that we can use agency to effectively undo social structures that is based upon an observation of the world without actually acting in the world and going out and doing things in the world. Good question.
Yeah, it really seems like you wrote your links for a much different AF.
Incorrect.
Our AF acknowledges our personal participation in violent
Your idea that we
structure.
should assume our individual identity to an ethics of feminist IR because patriarchal IR is universally untrue is basically our link, but there's a whole bunch of measures to make. Gotta move on, sorry.
Implications. First is resentment. When aggression is redirected by the superego against the ego, it results in humanity at war with itself. So aggressiveness is introjected and internalized and sent back to where it came from. Then consciousness replicates in bitterness. We are upset for the fact that we have to help the other and are responsible for the other, so we internally lash out internally, which causes us to do external violence as they turn to all of their violence arguments. The number 2 is that we consistently seek attachment to externalized actors for conducting violence against the weak. That allows us to do all kinds of fucked up things in the name of our idealism. Excuse me for my swearing. The next argument, there's no value to life. There turn to justice as they hope that by leveling the playing field, they will allow the weak to survive, which constrains the strong in the shackles of the weak. This destroys creative potential and harbors hostility to life. This approach wraps us in a literal shroud of nothingness because we're always constrained to what the feminist ideology tells us to believe. The next is purification programs. Their rigorous defense of an abstract ideal allows for total purging of other ideologies. An example of this was Stalinism, also Hitler, who used these sorts of purification programs, used the ideology of Nazism to justify killing off literally everyone who did not believe in the feminist ideal.
Also, the root cause of all of their violence in Cambodia, the Democratic Capucho made a utopian idea that we could revive communism.
Yeah, in Cambodia they made an ideal that we could somehow restore communism, which is an example of them turning inwards on themselves and causing all the impacts that they claim to solve. Additionally, people like Mary Daly are freaking crazy. They wanted to wipe out the entirety of the male race. If we see the authority to those individuals who represent their ethic, that would ultimately create those problems as well. That's a warrant for it. Alternative. You can open it. The judges should vote negative to embrace the will to power. The judges should vote negative to embrace the will to power. Solvency, first we say that rejecting ethics is key. The little a is it allows for reconceptualization of the world not based on an ethics of weakness. The little b is it allows us to transcend traditional methods of thinking. We're no longer relying on thinking about weakness, and also larger structural institutions as motivating our ethics. Additionally, it provides a meaningful transformation. Doesn't preclude for future action, just a dismantling and a balancing of said action. The number 2 argument is that our all creates an academic space where the construction of a new morality empowers individuals to act in a no, I don't want that argument. The number 3 argument is the all exists. I don't want the second half. The number 3 is the all exists beyond typical guidelines of morality. No longer do we rely on the larger institutions for direction or rely on the feminist scholars that they talk about for direction. We can construct things that are permutation preempts. First, any permutation is severance. It attempts to sever the fundamental logic and representations of the case, which would be a form of abuse and would be something that we call them out. The number 2 is that perm still links their reliance on their ethics, collapses any compromise in upon itself. The fact that we have to still use the ethical program means that it will inevitably implode. The next argument is that perm links worse. Even if we solve problems, we are built with a greater degree of resentment. We had the ability to escape and did not take it. That ultimately supercharges all of our implications. Your last question.
Yes. Thesis of your criticism in a sentence, please.
At the very top.
Very top. What is it that compels us to think that truth and anti-truth are, or what is it that allows us to think that good and evil are antithetical to one another? The fact that you use a slave-based form of ethics allows us to continually be, you know, dehumanized and do all kinds of screwed up things. You refuse to question life, in a sentence. You refuse to question life.
Thank you so much.
On their frameworks, they say bad methods make bad policy, but it's not just purely a question of methodology. You have to look to epistemology as creating representations. Where do you think we are able to construct those representations? It is based upon the philosophical tenets that we use. You say that domain equals representation is the only thing that we have. There is no more for this. There are literally infinite frameworks that could be used under the term representation, which means that you are using a vague term, and usually you say ontological foundation, but ontology and epistemology are interconnected with one another. You cannot simply say that ontology is the only thing that impacts. First, we say patriarchy is inevitable. As long as you don't undo the rude mentality of other people who are screwed up in other societies, you will never be able to undo this. Additionally, we say that you don't undo actual real material conditions and material constraints. The fact that there's a huge wage gap means that patriarchy replicates itself via other institutions like capitalism. Additionally, we scapegoat because we are effectively slaves. That's what caused all the problems that you describe in your implications. We are able to push off the blame of these problems onto those individuals. Additionally, we say turn. You create a dichotomy between the masculine and the feminine that ultimately collapses all solvency for your alternative because people who exist within those two categories ultimately are excluded, and undue violence is done to those individuals. An example of that is the Butler critique, which says that transgender people cannot exist within both because they are using these commodities. This is the problem with traditional feminism. Additionally, we say that Nietzsche and our alternative would adopt a balance of patriarchy and feminism. We recognize that patriarchy cannot coexist without feminism. There's no way of completely eliminating one, two. They are both truths in the real world, which means that we have to adopt one in order to embrace life. Additionally, we say that we make the lines of violence invisible, once we make it visible, allows it to be co-opted by slave ethics. Individuals who can use this to name or rally are able to take control of your alternative and effectively turn it back in on itself. Additionally, we say that there's growing awareness about obvious problems. That is all of the analysis that you talk about. Cambodia that proves that we are continuing to question these sorts of things. All of your arguments are non-unique at best. Additionally, we say that your alternative creates a fractionalization and ends the movement because people have to decide how they want to approach feminist ethics. Many interpretations. Me too.
Yeah. Sorry, once I get up there.
That might be the one that's not working. If not, you can use my purple or you can use my red.
It's going to be
It doesn't look that great, but it's fine.
case in order. The alternative. Then it's going to be their framework business.
Alternative include permutation freedoms.
Yes, that is all photo one sheet. Then it's going to be their framework. It's like integration, key evaluation, ethics or key business. Then their nature force to comply business. Then the links, then the impacts.
I'm on 2 pages, so can you sound just as again?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Ready? Okay. First group all of their arguments, that's fine. They need to have access to the criticism, but that is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, you're going to extend across the bad methodology being bad policy. Our argument is that we had to have to question how we situate ourselves in this. It's not ethically bankrupt. It's a precursor to any other action. That argument means that our affirmative is a prerequisite to any criticism that they talk about. This argument goes functionally conceded. We are not saying you do not get access to your criticism, but it's a prioritization argument, which we are going to be winning. But they also concede the argument that it's a question how we as an individual situate ourselves within the violence, which means that is a 100% turn to the criticism, because it's a question of how you situate yourselves in that violence. That is literally individual action they are criticizing us for not having. Now I'm going to do this because 100% conceded, extend across our argument that we use the aggression, we direct the notion to be forced upon the world, extend across the breaking down the structure that gets us 100% solvency to the impact, which we get to right against the criticism. Go to the impacts now. This first argument is patriarchy is inevitable. There's not a warrant for this argument. Our argument is this patriarchy is inevitable in the status quo. We're able to break down from this. Our next argument is we are saying that patriarchy, the way it is deployed in the status quo, is problematic, which means our feminist internationality, our feminist lens is able to solve back for this. The his next argument is the wage gap argument. The first argument to this is even if capitalism exists, we tell you capitalism is a vehicle of oppression, which means we were able to eliminate that form of oppression, i.e. sexism and patriarchy, and that is going to disrupt that vehicle, which means that we're never be able to get access to this. His next argument is the scope and get to themselves. There's not a word argument. Our argument is that we're able to solve for the root cause of violence. Our argument about Cambodia is spot on this. What happened was the UN was putting in troops to Cambodia. That was causing an increased amount of AIDS. That was causing an increased amount of prostitution. That was causing an increased amount of the sex workers. It literally tripled while they were there. Whereas when they pulled all of them out, introduced a feminist lens and put in teachers and construction workers and doctors, that was able to solve for the violence that was occurring, which is our argument that when we were able to implement a feminist lens, that is able to solve for the root cause of violence. That's able to solve for the dehumanization we talk about. They extend across. We affirm the value of life. This argument also goes conceded, which is devastating for them because they can see that we demobilize structural violence and manifest in problematic acts of violence, extend across our invisibility of violence. This argument answers a couple of things. The first, it answers all of the dichotomy arguments. In a world where violence is inevitable, we cannot combat it, which means this is a prior question to all of their ethics claims, because it's not a question of whether or not it's ethical. We have to see the problem before we can determine whether or not it's ethical, which means the invisibility of violence arguments come first. But his next argument is we create the dichotomy. The first is essential. It's the good in this instance for a couple of reasons. The eighth point under this is when we're able to essentialize different facets of movements. This is what's allowed to call. This is what's allowed to have activism occur. Afterward talks about this when they talk about how there is literally not a coalesced movement in the status quo because there is so much discussion as to what constitutes a feminist. When we're able to isolate facets of identities to coalesce behind those movements, that's what at least the real world practice that we're talking about. His next argument is the balancing out. It's a part of feminine. I've already answered above. Cosplay his arguments here. All of the theory arguments go 100% conceded. This is going to be problematic for them because they concede that the criticism comes first, which means that you evaluate the affirmative before you evaluate their there's more. Extend across the last parts of the impasse, they concede the utilitarian arguments as well as you prefer the violence of the affirmative. Alternative. First is the permutation to the affirmative. The eighth point of this, it solves all the links of the criticism because we're implementing a feminist lens, which is a new form of ethics. The B point of this is the perm solves for the expanding the permutation solves for the alternative joke, the alternative text, which means we're able to solve after this. The third is the permutation to both. A, it's a merging of praxis when we are able to merge contradictory ideologies, i.e. our essentialism argument.
They're just a reverse the one.
Thank you. Merging in practice, but this is literally our essentialism contradictory arguments here. This is a unique form, even if they're contradictory arguments, that's able to create a new form of ideology, which is going to be able to solve out for all the links of the affirmative and the criticism. This is the best form of ideology. This is our politics of despair arguments, even if it may lead to a bad thing in the short term, it is a better option later on, which would test the residual of the link. The fourth argument is permutation to the affirmative, then the criticism. The eighth point of this is also all the residual aspects of the criticism and avoid any co-option. Our argument is that their alternative will be co-opted for good reasons. The eighth point of this is the ace point under this is it would be co-opted because the state would view this as a direct violent action, which means that they would come in and co-opt it, whereas our affirmative would not be so because we are affirming the resolution, which means we are affirming the state through a feminist lens, which means it's a co-option from the inside. It's a covert co-option, whereas theirs is a blatant rejection, which means the state would co-opt it, which means they don't get any solvency. The next argument of this we would tell you is
I have a question.
What's up?
Okay, how is it that our alt gets co-opted, but your movement does not get co-opted as well? If yours is rejecting the dominant ideology within
if you were so caught up in wanting to ask the question, hadn't listened to my analysis, you wouldn't have missed it. Our argument is that we're a covert co-option because we affirm the resolution, whereas you are an outright rejection.
And the state wants a monopoly on violence. The praxis of your alternative would be way more threatening than ours, clearly.
Yes, clearly.
The next argument to this is they don't give you, they're all of their, okay, down to the permutation preamps. Group these. These do not give you any specific analysis as to what you would do with them. Two is they're going to come up with the MO and explain why each permutation links. This is uniquely abusive because we don't know what they're asserting when they say perm still links when I've explained specific arguments as to why our permutations get us out of links. But the next argument of this is we tell you even if the permutation is abusive, they're conceding that you would never evaluate theoretical perspectives via our contention for, which means none of their theory arguments coming in the MO would even matter. The next argument of this is the alternative has no solvency. The eighth point of this, they don't give you a warrant as to why this meaningful transformation would occur. Our argument is that meaningful transformation occurs when you affirm and action. We are literally the epitome of what the criticism is talking about because we are an investing agency within individuals, which means we're able to solve back for this. All of their links, all of their impacts don't matter in a world where we solve the criticism. means we are winning on this flow. But the next argument is the affirmative functions as a disadvantage to the alternative because they concede the value to life arguments. They also concede the root cause to violence arguments. Our argument is that is the prior question. When they concede those prior question arguments, that means we are the prior questions to the affirmative. On to the links. Oh, framework real quick. All of the framework arguments just say that they get their criticism. I've already answered this on the framework. Cross-play those arguments here. They say ethics are key, we say ethics are key, but in the context of our affirmative. On to the nature forced to comply argument. The first argument of this is it's a linker to our affirmative. The notion of nature versus the notion of natural versus unnatural is uniquely problematic in the context of a patriarchal dichotomy because it's what's used to exclude individuals. All of the arguments about eugenics and the Germans are literally what this is, which means they link into their own criticism. This is uniquely problematic because it's a flaw in their methodology, which means no one would be able to affirm their alternative, which means they have any solvency. It would be worse because there would be a backlash. The next argument of this is they don't give you warrants to why these are uniquely key to our affirmative links. First, let's put the analysis of how the individualism is key. This solves for 100% of the links. Number 200, this is we tell you that they link it to the affirmative because they are asserting notions as to what is and isn't true. The next argument is we tell you the agency is the prerequisite. This argument goes conceded from the affirmative, which means you cross-apply this here. The next argument of this is we are literally return to their criticism when we talk about how the status quo. All of their links are indicative of the status quo. They are not indicative of the affirmative per se, which means you would be privileging the analysis of the affirmative. Everything else, like the impacts, we solve 100% of the impacts. Their arguments about Daly are ludicrous. Argument isn't about Daly, but 2 is even if this is true, we tell you different ideologies, even if they're contradictory, are uniquely good because it's what leads to a true praxis form of argument, which means the alternatives and the permutations are the best way to solve both criticisms.
Alright.
Tom, when you get up there, can you throw me my inhaler?
Yeah.
As opposed to waiting for people again?
Okay. Our framework, their framework, an overview of the criticism, the impacts to our criticism, the permutations. I will see the argument that the alt gets co-opted. I put just on the alt page. If this makes sense, I'll sign those when I'm there too. But all the permutations together. Then the alternative. Links, thesis.
I'm just trying to be really clear because all my shit's just basically in a big long flow shit.
Unless you tell me where to put it, you're trusting me to put it somewhere.
Yeah.
And everyone in this room knows what it is.
That's why I hate K's when I'm pulling them on my computer. Yeah. Because they're like spawn. Damn it.
What?
Everybody good? Everyone have a vague semblance of what I'm going to talk about? No. Alright, that's fine. Alright, everybody good? From which she says we get our criticism, she's conceded our argument that ethics and ontology are required. You should reject all their claims to their affirmative as a prerequisite. Also, that you should reject their claims that you have to value their affirmative before you evaluate their criticism. Means that you should assess the impact of our criticism first, framework first, or their framework first. She says bad, and when they access our criticism, she is not answering our argument that you're bad. You create all the bad policies by stating at the starting point that patriarchy is universally something that needs to be rejected. Even if you think you can assert that through a type of agency, you were saying you should subsume yourself to a particular type of ethics, which means that creates all of our impacts and slave morality. You conceded basically the thesis of our impact stage. You also, your bad methodology prerequisite argument is precisely the link to our criticism. You are not able to say that something is a prerequisite or a prior question because that enslaves us to a particular question coming first. We are saying that we should reject these types of things of true and antitheticals of true and false. Something must become first instead of these. This creates a winge into our criticism. Also, you would then say that you would talk about the link to violence. I'll answer this elsewhere in the impacts page. Also, you say on the that's fine. Okay, overview. The thesis of our criticism is that good and evil, patriarchy and feminism are not antithetical. These are just outmoded moral precepts that force us to bind us and subsume ourselves into individual values. The only value to life can be possibly accepted is their value. This creates a controlling thing. The implication of this is several multifold. First, it denies value to life because it's impossible to affirm agency when we are constantly subsuming ourselves into the feminism. This makes it impossible for them to solve their affirmative. Also creates all the types of violence they are talking about because we are able to conduct purge programs in the name of feminist ideology. This is precisely what happened in the Democratic Kombucha and the Soviet Union. It was not just distinction distinction between others that created violence. It was the name of doing utopian things in the name of things that allowed us to commit violence against them, because these particular classes of individuals opposed our utopian vision. This is precisely their arguments about the way movements work. They have functionally conceded our analysis of how a purge program happens means their affirmative ultimately causes all the impacts we're talking about. Impacts.
Oh, you're going there.
Impacts. First, she says they solve 100%. There's zero answer to our argument about the nature of purge programs. We're also giving more specific examples about Cambodia. Your analysis is just about prostitution. We're talking about the genocidal regimes that your actual impacts are. That means that type of violence ultimately happens to death. We've also conceded all of our arguments that it's impossible to affirm value of life. We think that we have to reject patriarchy on every conceivable level. This means that you don't get access to any of our argument. You also answer our impact by saying that we have a better ideology. This is precisely the link to our argument.
They say multiple ideologies.
They say they get multiple ideologies. That's a permutation. I'll answer that. Yeah. Permutation. Frame the permutation like this in order to win. They need to win that not only is their advocacy not that has no traces of an old moral ideology, but also that it's an act that is more willful than the alternative alone. First, they have conceded basically all of our permutation First, she says permutation do the alternative. Her first argument is that this solves because it creates a new ethics. That is the link to our criticism. Means it obviously bites into the general link thesis of ours. Also, she says that this solves the alternative but gives zero warrant. She's conceded our preempt. She has basically conceded the thesis of our preempts that they just create new ethical systems. Even if they say this is precisely embodied in the fact that they say that they are capable of solving our alternative by affirming life, by subsuming us to a feminist ideology that says patriarchy is universally something to be rejected. This means permutation do the alt does literally nothing. She's also that's fine. Next, she says permutation do both merger or praxis. First is totally impossible. Your praxis says that we have to do a specific thing. Also, says we have to reject patriarchy in all instances. Joe's going to try to recharacterize what their PMC was, but they said that the old system, the patriarchy ideology is bad. We need to insert a new one. This is demonstrated by their movement-based solvency that they create new lines of identification with movement that are capable of resisting patriarchy and changing practices internationally. This is obviously a good link into our argument. Then she said this creates the best ideology. That is precisely our argument. Merging things to create a new ideology and saying everyone needs to affirm life by embracing feminism is precisely the problem. It says that these groups of people have not done this, means those people can be exterminated. That is the root cause of all of your violence. And she says permutation do the affirmative and then the criticism. This creates co-option. The co-option arguments are stupid. I'll answer them on the alternative proper. Also, this is all a ridiculous argument. The alternatives is just both of us are just advocating that the judges do something. Means that you would circle affirmative and then vote negative. So that's fine. Do the affirmative and then vote for the negative. That's ridiculous. There's no delay permutation on a criticism. Then she tries to answer our preempt by saying there's no analysis and that it's abusive to say that the permutation still links. This is obviously a fucking ludicrous argument. Also, both of us agree that there's no real impact in theory. Also, she hasn't articulated this as vote. She has also not answered the general thesis of these arguments. She just says that there's no analysis. That's an assertion. Nigel makes pretty clear arguments that any sort of permutation still links to an old system of ethical obligations that we have to embrace feminism at all costs.
And also that it links worse because we have the ability to escape.
Also that it links worse because we currently have the ability to escape, but they foreclose that. Alternative proper. This is where I'll answer the argument that the alternative gets co-opted that was probably on the perm sheet. First argument is that this gets co-opted by the state. That's not true. All of your analysis in the PMC says that this debate does not escape this round. There's no statist ideology looking at us. We're just saying the judges should take a particular action to reject your embraceable ethics. Also, there's also no interaction between our alternative and the state. We are saying that we should reject it.
He's answering the co-op.
I'm answering the co-op. Cool. Also, she says that they think the state wants a monopoly on violence. This argument doesn't make any sense. The only way to get out of the monopoly on violence is if every individual is capable of affirming life. We control the way in which violence happens with the most detailed analysis. Then she says our alternative doesn't solve their affirmative. This is obviously true in all of our analysis about the way ethics work. Also, our alternative allows us to have a balance of patriarchy and feminism. Means creates all of the new perspectives that they are talking about. Allows each individual to affirm that in their own particular volition. Means that creates a better value to life. It's everything. She says meaningful transformation. This argument is totally fucking ludicrous and just not only to our criticism. That is not just argument that your idea that we can create meaningful transformation by embracing a particular system of ethics is precisely the problem. Also, there's zero warrant to this analysis. Then she says the affirmative is a disadvantage to the alt. That is incorrect. We have not conceded your value to life link. We are just making a different claim about the nature of value to life things. You have made zero analysis. Do not allow the PMR to make new analysis about what value to life means. Links. She says they allow the individual to create itself, and this solves all of our links. You have not answered the specific type of link. First is that you attempt to control the world by saying that we can create a new feminist ideology that's capable of transforming system in Cambodia is particularly bad. That argument does not go answer. She also concedes our argument that we pin causality on things like patriarchy. Means that patriarchy is universally condemned as the enemy. This means that even if they say they are affirming the individual, there is no actual warrant to this, nor does it answer the specifics of our link argument. Also, she has conceded Nigel's final link argument that we undo agency by saying that we have to affirm a particular ideology. Then she said agencies and prerequisites already answered this argument elsewhere, that prerequisites are a bad way to evaluate things and it denies our value to life. Then she says our link, prove a link to their affirmative. This argument is totally fucking ludicrous. No warrant whatsoever.
They make an argument that this is indicative of what the status quo is.
Oh, then they see this is just indicative of, no, that's not the case.
Okay.
Thesis.
No, I'm pretty sure they say.
Fine. They say this is indicative of the status quo. Alternative escapes what the status quo looks like by embracing a new type, by embracing the will of power, right? I've already explained what the alternative does. Thesis. She tries to make a link argument on nature versus unnatural. This is just an example of the way things like Stoicism and new systems of ethics subsume the world into their particular ways of viewing ideology, etc. This means that we are not linking, we are not saying the world works in natural versus unnatural terms. We are rejecting those type of antitheticals. This is not a link. She's misunderstood what our thesis page was saying. She's also misunderstood the way our thesis says genocide and violence to value to life happens. She says we're talking about Germans making bad. I've already answered this argument elsewhere. Case. Most of her arguments are basically the same, that they solve the root cause of violence. First, I want you to go over her Cambodia argument. First, I've already answered why violence. I've already explained why violence happened in Cambodia. It's because of utopian visions of ability to transform things. She gives a specific example of switching to a feminist ideology, but that ideology can become just as totalitarian. That is the thesis of our criticism that was basically computed then, unrefuted. Then she also says that that their dichotomies are good and that they create an essentialism that is key to informing value of life. That's precisely our link. I want you to quote her rhetoric here and apply it to our link page. You will see precisely what I'm talking about. Then theory, she says, we concede theory means you have to consider the affirmative first. This argument doesn't make any sense. We just agree that you shouldn't evaluate things like permutation and severance, but not a reason to consider the F first. I've also already made answers as to why that's a bad way to understand it.
All right. Order will be an overview, then the alternative. And I'll go alternative proper, then the permutation. Framework, link, impacts, framework, thesis, that's what I would call the nature, natural, unnatural arguments. Link, impact, case. Alternative first, overview, alternative, framework, thesis, link, impact, thereafter. A fundamental misunderstanding of the thesis of our criticism is what allows us to win. The fact that they completely undercover all of the implications in Link's page means that even if you don't think the alternative somehow solves, even though they concede the alt solves back to criticism, means that we still have a case turn that has been 100% conceded, means that we will be able to win. Go to the alternative now. This is where they're going to try and hedge all of their bets in today's debate. They have conceded all of our arguments that we create meaningful transformations and that we are able to transcend traditional morality. These are all conceded arguments. They're going to go for this co-option argument. It is freaking dumb. And not only is it linked to their argument just as hard because they engage in the same sort of co-option, but additionally the fact that we preempt all of these arguments about escaping earlier on in the speech means that it will never engage with it. Additionally, there's no effective delineation on what that covert co-option is and also what it means. They have to win the permutation to win this argument. Perm. I'm going to extend across the last argument I read on the perm preempts, which is that the perm links worse. Think about it right now. You are given the option to escape the shackles of a slave morality. You have the ability to effectively transcend traditional conceptions of morality. If you do the permutation, you collapse back, and on that creates more resentment because you're bitter for the fact that you did not escape it when you had the chance. You additionally concede the argument that the permutation still links. Their reliance on their ethics means that their movement will inevitably implode in upon itself. They will go for these arguments that their AFF is key to essentialism, that it's key to the politics of disparity, but we say that any reliance on the original system prevents a complete and total break, which is necessary to solve the criticism and prevent the case turn. Framework. Undercover all this, that means that ethics matters just as much as your AFF. No way that you can effectively say that your AFF is a prerequisite to anything else, because you can see all of these standards on why looking at ethics is important. Joe is going to get up and give great impact calculus on why their affirmative needs to come before everything else, but that is fucking irrelevant when they can see the framing of the debate. Thesis. You have misunderstood the unnatural-natural dichotomy. That is something that we critique, which means that if anything, you have just given us another example or just helped us explain our thesis page. You've also conceded the arguments at the very bottom about categorical imperatives. The fact that you can use your dialectical babbling via feminism allows you to re-entrench all the problems that we indict in our links and impacts. Links. Makes a bunch of warrantless arguments without actually engaging in the actual substance of the links. Our links are very simple. In a world in which they try to pin the causality on a larger social structure. That is what allows them to scapegoat and shift blame onto other people, and allows us to entrench ourselves within an ethic of weakness. They are going to go hard for this argument that it's indicative of the status quo, but that is not. As long as our alternative has the ability to solve, we can overcome that. Additionally, there's no warrant to why the status quo is uniquely more resentful than the post-plan. Additionally, they have conceded they attempt to control the world, which is the beginning point for our criticism. Implications. Humongous mistake conceding the entirety of this page. You can see the last impact, which is the purification programs. That is the only warrant for the only impact in today's debate round. The reason why people like Hitler and Stalin are able to develop is because they can use these codes of morality to effectively oppress individuals and purge the entirety of them. You have also conceded the argument that there is no value to life in the status quo, or in the instance of your plan, the fact that you continue to deny and refuse life, which is what allows us to continually allow it to be meaningful. That means that your plan effectively implodes in upon itself and makes the problems that you indicted the status quo far worse. This is a case turn at the very least, which is a reason to vote for the negative. Framework. Again, on their AF. They're going to go very hard for these arguments that their AF somehow needs to come before everything else. Not important because they have conceded our framework from the get-go. Additionally, we said that your AF ultimately entrenches the problems that you are attempting to solve. On your impacts page, the only impact that you have at the end of today's debate is the violence in Cambodia, but Tom has located the precise ideology, the precise point at which those sorts of harms begin, which means that we ultimately replicate and create those problems more. And on the theory page, nobody read T, nobody's going for perm severance, irrelevant.
Okay, the order is contention 2 and contention 3 of the PMC, followed by the MOC order of the criticism, with the exception of, the permutation debate.
What is the MOC order? I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. Contention 2 and contention 3 of the case. The MOC order, as I have it, is a little bit of the framework debate, but the contention 2 arguments, your impact arguments, and then permutation debate on ballot. So,
Okay, so perm is the last thing you talked about? This case, and then perm basically?
yeah, the order is contention 2 to the AF, contention 3 to the AF, and your criticism.
Okay.
With the permutation debate on the bottom.
Thank you.
I don't flow substructure, so what's contention 2 and 3? Like,
Of
what's
the case?
yeah.
The solvency business, i.e. like our plain text,
Okay.
information business,
And then the
and
impact.
impacts.
Okay.
Just tell me where you are.
It's Joe being difficult is what it is.
No.
Good.
Every single attempt to cast arguments that we read as impact turns to your strategy, or reasons why you should get to lose this debate as reasons why we link to your criticism, are also reasons why our argument operates as disadd to the praxis of your alternative. Almost every single argument we read is empowered to be offense in a world where every argument you read is to say that our strategy is incompatible with that. And in a world where that is the case, then we will ultimately win on the argument that not only is our argument a disadd to the praxis of your alternative, but will also probably beat you on impact calculus and the permutation debate. For example, their insistence that our essentialism arguments do not link proves that we are a disadd to the praxis of their alternative in a world where we don't have the ability to coalesce strategies that are activist in the praxis of their alternative. If their argument is authentically true that this is incompatible, that proves why their argument is incompatible with agency. We have impact arguments in the PMC indicating why agency is critical to any kind of impact argument. The perpetuation of the status quo is inevitable in a world without agency, which means they cannot control any comparative impact claim without the question of agency. It's literally the only thing that matters. Now, if their argument is also true that the kinds of characterizations of suggesting the priority questions are ultimately linked to their criticism, then we will still win that our argument is a disadd to that, because the inability to prioritize the concerns of our affirmative are a disadd to the praxis of your alternative if all of your impact calculus is accurate, which means we will decisively beat you on the impact debate. Contention 3, they wholly concede the invisibility of violence arguments in the block. There's literally no answer. They have conceded the argument about how this answers their dichotomy answers, which is important because that resolves a lot of their residual offense, but also this argument comes before other deliberative concerns. We have arguments indicating why the only reason why you could possibly conceive of your alternative as valuable, that we should try to propagate the will of violence is because you don't understand the kind of violence that happens and how extensive it is. Our invisibility of violence arguments are obviously the round winner, because when we constantly push violence to the periphery, then we're allowed to propagate violence like the bare praxis of your alternative. If you are accurate that all of these arguments are incompatible with the praxis of your alt, then that proves why the affirmative is something we should embrace. Now, they also say that we are not allowed to prioritize in terms of the ability to break down these masculine-feminine dichotomies. That is also their essentialism arguments. If that's the case, that also proves why they can never resolve the root cause of violence arguments, which means we will always control the impact calculus. You only think your alternative matters because you have not come to grips with our invisibility of violence arguments. The only way in which anybody could possibly position it to be a good idea to suggest that we should embrace the will of violence is if they truly did not acknowledge the invisibility of violence in the everyday that happens attributable to patriarchy, which means you will vote for the affirmative as a disad to their alternative. All of their impact calculus arguments indicating why these arguments are incompatible with their alternative and linked to the criticism are reasons actually why you should not embrace their criticism. They have conceded a vast majority of these arguments. Now, in terms of their criticism arguments, the very top of the MOC begins with arguments that say the priority questions are impossible in their framework and that we are analogous to a slave morality. Again, if all of these arguments are accurate, that proves Ali's assessment that we are truly an authentic disad to the alternative. This is a question of agency, and you're behind on the agency question because you conceded arguments not only on the case debate, but also in terms of your criticism, indicating why you are incompatible with that. We have an argument that says that agency is a prerequisite. You try to go for your last link argument, to try to get ignorance to this, but you have largely conceded the argument that the only way in which we could actually approach the issue of agency is in a world where we do confront the power structures that you suggest we cannot confront in the praxis of your alternative. If that's true, then we will win the debate on the question of agency. Game over, done. We're disad to your alt, and we definitely outweigh your argument, which means we'll control the impact calculus. Now, they say that the natural versus unnatural distinctions are ultimately irrelevant, but we have arguments under this that indicate why you link to your affirmative just as badly as we do. For example, the constructed ethics of your alternative and the notion that we have to be rejected in favor of that is literally the same link argument that you read for not only the number 1 and the number 2 link argument, which means at worst we have so small risk, we at least have a good risk that you also link to your alternative, which is a good reason why you can never resolve the criticism. That's also another reason to default and privilege the impact constructions in terms of the PMC permutation debate.
Point of order.
Devastating.
Point of order. Nice.
The way I have this argument, or the argument you're going for that the alternative links into the criticism itself, the way I have this argument explained in the, MG, is that we make a distinction between natural and unnatural, and that causes a link into our criticism.
I'm not talking about the natural versus unnatural distinction argument. I'm referencing the argument under that, which talks about the control and securitization, the bullying arguments, and the causality arguments. Ali says that the way in which your constructed ethics are situated are also bullying and attribute causality badly, and that saying that we should be rejected for that also causes the same thing.
This is the argument that begins with something about the Germans.
No, this is the argument after that. The eugenics argument is the natural versus unnatural argument. I'm not referencing that. I'm referencing the argument right under that. It is the number 1 and the number 2 is a response to your second and third ones. Okay.
Permutation debate, absolutely devastating. You're right, the second permutation is very bad. We should not get to go for the delayed permutations against criticism arguments. Absolutely accurate, but you have devastatingly made a huge mistake on the first permutation. Tom answers this argument by assuming that our permutation is due the alternative. That would probably not be solvent if in a world of your conception of the way the alternative works. The problem is we have our permutation is actually to do the affirmative, and we have arguments indicating why the critical merging of praxis and abstract academia that is consistent with our affirmative has the possibility of creating new ideological perspectives that could access the alternative, which means they do not get to answer, they do not get to resolve anything. There is a large risk that this permutation resolves this, and this is a devastating mistake for them. We also have our conceded politics of despair arguments, which indicate that even if in the short term we trigger their criticism arguments, if we fail over the long term, then we will still lead to the praxis of their alternative, which means there's no reason to risk their criticism in a world where this is true. There's a large chance that our affirmative has the ability to confront issues of structural violence that are more important than their alternative would have you believe. If everything we say is incompatible with their alternative, that's a reason not to embrace their alternative. But if their argument is accurate, you'll embrace the permutation, because even if we fail in the short term, we'll cause their alt in the long term if we do fail. So there's only a reason to risk the affirmative. They concede the argument that we can create new ideologies and our politics of despair argument, which is the first permutation that you have largely unresolved. Your preamps don't resolve this. You said it's due the alt. No, it's due the AF, and we have arguments about why we access your alt. Game over.